Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to welcome Judith, who is a sports scientist and a sports dietitian based in Austria. And Judith works at like a high performance level. So she's based at the Olympic Center in Salzburg, so in Austria. And then she's also the head of nutrition for the Skiing Federation in Austria. And she has tons of experience working with cyclists and specifically athletes doing winter sports. And she'll be talking about a really challenging topic today, or a topic that I find particularly challenging because the research behind it, there is some generic guidelines, but there are a lot of conflicting views when it comes to the research on hydration. And then when working with a specific client one-to-one, it is very individual and it will depend on many factors from their age, from environmental conditions, the exercise intensity, and so on. And so it involves a lot of trial and error. And Judith will present some case studies today, which will be really interesting. So we'll let Judith present first, and feel free to use the chat box to pop in some questions, but we'll try and leave the Q&A towards the end. So we'll have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. Right, I'll pass it on to you now, Judith.
Okay, thanks. Also, wonderful evening from my side. I'm happy I can share some thoughts on hydration with you this evening. And I hope I can give you also some examples of useful examples how to approach this and maybe also how to put it into practice with your clients or if you're an athlete for yourself. So when I started to think about this evening and the webinar, it actually took me back to about 15 years ago when I did a small study on ski mountaineers. And this was my first focus really on hydration as well. We assessed sweat rate and looked how much water they lost on a tour that took them about 30 minutes. And they had very different sweat rates. So this was a really interesting project for me. And it was the first contact with me really with hydration and fluid needs in athletes. And also for tonight, I thought just have a look because we barely talk about hydration. We talk a lot about carbohydrates, we talk about proteins, but we never really talk about hydration, or it always comes last. That's at least what my impression is. And so I pulled out a couple of books that I have at home and I checked on the content where they do have hydration, where it's listed. When is the chapter on water and hydration? And as you can see on this slide, there's a lot of information that comes before hydration. And for me, this is a nice confirmation of what happens also in the work with athletes. They usually approach me to talk about carbs and supplements. They never really come and talk to me about hydration. What should I drink? How much do I have to drink? How do I, in the best way, rehydrate after exercise, after my competition? But for me, it's one of the topics that is really on the top list, also because I work with a lot of endurance athletes, where, of course, hydration is a very big topic. And I took then another look and checked also the web, what's out there on hydration products, on different sports drinks, mixes, electrolyte tablets. And there we can see there is quite an interest, and there's especially an interest in electrolyte mixes, sports drinks, how to replace electrolytes. So on the one hand, it's always in the end or comes very last to talk about it in consultations and in the work with athletes. But on the other hand, you see there is a big interest also from the industry. And why is this? Why is there this interest in hydration, in products that help us stay hydrated or rehydrate after exercise? Well, water is a very important nutrient. It's involved in pretty much every physiological function. Can be the control, it can be lubricants, just the product water, and it's the solute for some other nutrients. So it's very important. And our body, in the end, it's 2/3 of the body is water. So it's a nice homeostasis. We need water, and if there is an impact on our hydration status, then of course, with this ton of water, it has some impact on the body, on health, and also on performance. And that's why it's also very important. And when we look closer where the water is, how the distribution is, I think also with regards to exercise and performance, it's very interesting that we find a lot of water in the brain and in the muscle, because those two are very important for a lot of sports, whether it's more the cognitive function or whether it's the mental aspect, and then of course the muscle to keep the level of performance high towards the end and until the end of exercise or competition. So yes, if there is a disturbance of water and fluid status, this of course seems to really, there's a reason why this impacts also our sporting performance. But when we go from the distribution of water to the literature and look what's out there from the American College of Sports Medicine, from their latest positions, then it's already almost 20 years old now, but it's still a good reference. There is also a nice paragraph that talks about the evidence statement of hydration, and there are two A's for the evidence category. So yes, there's it seems important for hydration. Doesn't seem important, it is important for hydration. And also we have good data that the loss of fluids and also electrolytes impairs performance, and that it should be also one of the goals of us practitioners, but also of every individual athlete, to replace the fluids and electrolyte lost and to minimize these losses to really maximize the performance. And exercise is one of those triggers for this disturbance. And the longer we exercise, the more intense we exercise, there is an increase in body temperature, which then triggers the sweat response and the production of sweat. So we lose the sweat. And it's a challenge. And this, I think when we all look back to the last years, changes in temperatures, a lot of hot days, a lot of hot and humid days, especially considering some major competitions when we go back until the Rio Olympics and then go from Rio to Dubai to Tokyo, even Paris this year. We've seen a lot of major competitions where heat was a very big topic in the lead up to the events, how we prepare athletes, but also on the lower level, not just on the elite level, but even recreational athletes. We see, and I also notice more symptoms, more problems that are related to heat, to hydration, to dehydration. So yes, this is a very important topic and also one that we should take a close look to. And when we talk about hydration, we saw it already before on this one slide with the results from my search on the web. We often talk about electrolytes, and my impression is that we talk more about electrolytes, especially sodium and magnesium, and not so much about water, fluid loss, actually, which is also very important. And as we lose the water, as we lose fluids, we also lose electrolytes. And when we think about electrolytes in the body, really related also to exercise and to shifts there. Those that are usually mentioned, that's magnesium, sodium, you have the calcium, bicarbonate is also an electrolyte, chloride. And when we analyze sports drinks that are available on the market, energy gels, electrolyte tablets, that's usually the electrolytes that we find in there to replace them during exercise or after exercise to minimize the losses. But interestingly, when we look at the literature, and I know some of my colleagues, they probably don't fully agree with me, but when we look at the literature, it's usually recommended to really pay attention to sodium, so salt intake, sodium losses, and replace those. Kind of mentioned as the most important electrolytes, where we see also the most significant losses during exercise, and especially as all this weather, we all have those images in mind. the losses can really be huge, and it's important to replace those. And replace those especially with longer sessions. During the when we look at the literature, usually it's recommended, especially in sessions that last longer than 2.5 hours, to really also pay attention to add sodium and potassium to the sports drink to give the body some more electrolytes, give it back the one that we lose during sweat. So that's one thing, electrolytes, which is very important, and we'll have a few more slides later also on with regards to replacement sources, when to replace, how much we should replace from those, also with the practical examples. And the other thing that's very important also, and it brings me back to the role of water, fluids in the body in general. That's why I sometimes also wonder why we don't talk about hydration more than a lot of us do, because exercise leads to a rise in body core temperature. And we know as the temperature rises and that we start to sweat, we lose some performance and the level drops, especially if we don't replace those losses. And there is a lot of data out there where we see that athletes, some start already dehydrated, but a lot of athletes, they come back, they finish their session in a significantly dehydrated state. And it's important because dehydration has some impact on performance, and an increase in body core temperature, especially in climates right now with a rise in temperature in the summer, but in general, it's even more important to keep this body temperature down. And before, when I talked to Ian and Simone, I said we could talk a whole evening or maybe more also about cooling and pre-cooling, and it's not part of my presentation. There's a lot of good literature and recommendations out there as well. But of course, exercise, fluid replacement, it is very important also to keep body temperature low and avoid really overheating during exercise. When we think about hydration status in general, where do we lose fluids, and how can we ingest, or what are the sources for us to bring those fluids back into the body and correct hydration status? And of course, we have food and drink, and this is something that I will also go into later with suggestions that I have for my athletes to rehydrate after exercise. And we have a little bit of metabolic water as well. But I think especially for exercise, huge fluid loss is the water with drinks and food is the most important, especially drinks then, to replace huge losses. And for the loss of fluids from the body, we do lose a lot via the skin, and this changes a lot with exercise, with intensity, with training status. It changes a lot also with the clothing. When we think about winter sports, where I also work, we have a lot of clothing just to keep us also warm. And we climb up a mountain in the winter. It's different. We don't notice the sweat because we don't see it also run down on the skin. We don't feel it. So there are a lot of different amounts that we lose. There are a lot of different sweat rate that come with different conditions. And the major loss is definitely via the skin when we exercise, when we sweat. How does this work? What happens when we sweat, when we start exercise? Body temperature rises. We can lose fluids with sweat, but of course there are also other situations, whether it's diarrhea, whether it's vomiting, where we also lose a significant amount of fluids. But when we talk about exercise, of course, it's sweating, and it leads to dehydration. And this dehydration impacts performance, and then we need to replace the amounts we lost, because if we don't replace it adequately, we see there is an increase in RPE, in rate of perceived exertion. We see a significant decrease in performance, but also we see a slower transport of nutrients, carbohydrates to the muscle. So performance suffers. Sweat rates also decreases, which is something that I think is very important also to mention and to highlight when we talk later about assessing the individual sweat rate. And I think in a more broader range, also for the general athletic population, it's also very important that dehydration increases the cardiac stress, and it's a lot of stress also for the system. So we train, we want to be active, to be healthy, to stay healthy. But if we train and finish our sessions 5 times out of 7 during the week in a significantly dehydrated state, then the heart is probably not as healthy as it could be. So really also here very important to consider this one. And when we look at the literature, fluid balance, when we start to sweat, we lose the fluid, and already 1% can have some effect on our mental performance. 2%, we know that endurance performance is impaired, and from experience from the work with athletes, a lot of athletes, they finish their workouts, they finish their competitions with way more than 2%. Not all of them are aware of it, but when we start also to look more deeper into their sweat rate before we set up then their hydration protocol, it's usually a big surprise how much fluids they lose in a session. So, which is of course a good feedback that there is really need to work on it and to pay attention to it. We see a lot of decreases in performance. VO2 max, O2 max is also impacted with significant dehydration of 2 to 3% of body weight. And I just mentioned here also the 60 kilo person, because it's not a lot, 2% or 3% of body weight. So a lot of athletes come back and they lost like 2.5 kilos. We don't need to lose 2 kilos to be significantly dehydrated, a lot of us. So it's 1 kilo more or less for a lot of athletes, or 1.5 to lose to be still in the okay range with hydration. When we then start to talk about hydration, one of the most common questions and most frequent question is, how much do I have to drink? And this brings me then to the more practical part of it. Well, what's the answer? There's not really one answer that is the right one for everyone, because we are different. We have a different amount of muscle mass. We have different ages, different training status. This all comes into play for hydration, body composition, the amount of muscle mass that we have. So it's difficult, and we need to assess it and we need to measure it. And it's, for me, since I work with endurance athletes, it's a very big part of my work that I do fairly regularly with those athletes, a couple of times during the year, to reassess also hydration status. And when we look into the literature, there are some broader guidelines. 1.5 liters, that's what the Austrian Dietetics Association is recommending for the general population, not to athletes, but in general. When we look to the Academy of Dietetics, they recommend 11.5 cups for women and 15.5 cups for men, for the average man. But this covers fluids and food. So they really cover their fruits, vegetables, soups, other meals that also contain a little bit of fluids. But still, it's a big amount that we have to consume there. And when I start to work with athletes to answer this question, I usually refer to the hydration, to the urine color chart, to use this one. And I think it's a very practical tool. I've used this with a lot of teams that I've worked with. I've used this also with individual athletes. Just put them up in the team bus or in the training center to have even just a quick reminder in the morning or after training to check your hydration. And it's a nice way, uncomplicated way, really, to assess your hydration status before exercise or after exercise, in the morning when you get up and when you have an important session just ahead of you. And really then it's important to do this in training. Like with carbohydrate gels, carbohydrate drinks, we often see, or I often see the mistake that athletes think about hydration when it's time to compete and not during training. So it's important also really to assess it in training and to do this also daily, because for me, the goal with every session is to get the best out of every training session. And this means also to start well hydrated, you hydrated, and finish it with less than 2% of loss of body weight, especially if it's a longer session that they are doing. What is also very important is to highlight that dehydration or sweat rates, they differ with intensity, but also between training and competition because there are different clothings. For some sports, they differ. We have also different intensities. In a lot of sports, we never really train at the intensity that we are competing. So this is also very important to pay even a closer look at it. But of course, also to start and look into it and to assess it during training to make sure that we are on top of our hydration. And for me, this starts, like I said, in the morning. And usually assessing it in the morning, collecting urines when I'm traveling with teams or with athletes to really make sure that they start the session in a good hydration status. When we look into the literature, I mentioned here ACSM, they do recommend to drink about 5 to 7 milliliters per kilogram in the hours before exercise. And in case of dehydration, to drink also some more extra fluids to really make sure that you are rehydrated and you start your session well hydrated. And when we look, I know it from practical experience, but also there when you look into the literature, I mentioned just this one paper from female cross-country skiers and male cross-country skiers, where they did 2 days with nutrition analyses, and they looked into training and competition nutrition. And on the competition day, 56% of the male and 38% of the female cross-country skiers, they were dehydrated in the morning. And this is just one example, and there are a few more that show that a lot of our athletes, they start competition already dehydrated. So they give already a little bit of their maximum performance away without even exercising, even before. So it's important to take a closer look and brief them, provide them with knowledge, but also with the skills to start well hydrated. And why this is important to take the time and sit down is because we have a lot of different rates of sweat loss. Even just in this example here, 70 kilo athlete, it changes with different environmental conditions. So there is also not just one broad general recommendation. It doesn't exist for a whole team, but even for the one individual athlete, there need to be different recommendations based on different environmental conditions. And this is important. That's why also assessing and reassessing sweat rate and fluids hydration status during the season, during the pre-season, it's important to really make sure that they stay on top of it and hydrate enough. And this is just another example. It's from the ACSM position stand. Different sports here as well, just to show again how different sweat rates are among sports and among athletes, males and females. So like with a lot of other things in nutrition, there is not one size fits all or one recommendation fits all. Hydration is really down to the individual athlete to assess it and also to put this hydration protocol together so they have like a drinking plan for competition, for training to stay on top of it. And I think especially looking at the literature and even here in this example, that's mostly or that's really 100% of those sports listed here. It's summer sports. Now I work in summer sports, but also winter sports, which is for me also very interesting to compare and also to explore, because unfortunately we do not have a lot of literature that talks about winter sports and hydration. So there are a lot of different aspects that come into play and that are maybe even more challenging for winter sport athletes. One is also in cold temperatures when we train. When we are in the mountain, we lose a lot of fluids also via respiration. And this is not the sweat that runs down on the skin. We don't notice it. And we don't realize how much fluid we lose really when we train outdoors for 2 hours, 3 hours. Some athletes that do really long sessions out there. So it's very important. And I've really had a lot of surprises with winter sport athletes when we worked on hydration. When they realized, hey, I need to drink more than those 300 milliliters per hour because I lose a lot of fluids during my session. So really taking this into consideration is also very important, especially because a lot of our winter sport athletes, they train at altitude, and even altitude is again changing fluid needs there as well. And like I mentioned before, we also have clothing aspect in sports, which is very important. It's November now, and at least in Austria, we get ready also to get on the mountain and to get on the snow. Also reassessing my sweat rate when I do a ski tour, when I'm out there on the mountain. But also cyclists that train in the winter, that are outdoors, and they go on the bike for 90-minute, 2-hour session. The sweat rate it's definitely different compared to August or September when it's still warmer. So this is of course very important. Sweat rate is different, and we need to pay more attention to it, because in the summer, like it also shows here in the picture, we feel it, the sweat, we see it on the skin, but we don't really see it when we climb a mountain and we have all the clothing, the apparel that we're carrying with us up the mountain. So how do we assess our sweat rate? It's a weigh-in. We need to weigh before and after the session, ideally with minimal clothing or no clothing at all, to assess hydration status, to see how much fluid we lose when we go out and go for a run for 60 minutes, jump on a scale before and jump on a scale afterwards. And like in this example, when it's 1.5 liters that we lose, then we should at least replace those 1.5 liters. Ideally, it's even more, to replace what we've lost there, and make sure that we rehydrate until the next session or until the next day when we train. And I'll go more into detail how to do this, also with which foods and drinks. But it's important then to consider also, in case we ingest fluids, to add them to the amount of kilos or to the amount of weight lost. So if we consume 200 milliliters, we would have to add those to the 1.5 kilos in this case here, and it's 1.7, so even more to drink. A note maybe on assessing sweat rate. I work in a lot of endurance sports. I also work in a lot of sports where we do have quite a high number also of athletes with eating disorders or disordered eating. And I think this is also important to kind of think about and keep in mind that for some athletes, weighing pre-post a session can be quite a lot of stress, mental stress. So I would not weigh an athlete who maybe had an eating disorder or still has an eating disorder, ask them to get on the scale and check the weights, maybe just do it blinded, and tell them how much they do have to drink if there is a possibility to do blinded weighing. But I would also be really careful with young athletes and athletes that do not seem ready to be weighed or to weigh themselves pre-post, to really minimize the stress here. What is also very important, we talked a little bit about electrolytes already. This is just a study here from Shiris that shows also how much we lose during a session. And this is a nice example that shows, depending on how much we drink, we also have different sweat rates. So also how we go into a session, how much fluid we replace, we probably lose more fluids if we have a good hydration protocol, if we keep continuously ingesting also some fluids. If we start well hydrated, we definitely have a higher sweat rate compared to those that start already dehydrated, because we only have a certain amount of fluids in the body that we can then lose via sweat. So Staying on top of hydration is also very important, to stay on top of thermoregulation and keep body temperature low, like the ones slide before showed already. And we see this also here. The amount of fluids we ingest also have an impact on the sweat rate of the individual athlete. And like the fluids that we ingest, also salt we ingest. Of course, also if you're somebody who's eating a lot of salty foods, we also have a higher concentration of salt or sodium in our sweat. But also just in general, we do have a different sodium concentration in the sweat. So we do have salty sweaters, and we do have sweaters that are athletes that are not losing that much salt with their sweat, which also might affect then the sports drink that we choose. If we choose one that is a little bit higher in sodium, or if we choose one that is just regular, or maybe has no salt at all when we do shorter sessions. So there is a very individual difference there as well, depending on the different climate. In this case, there's cool, moderate, and warm climate, but also gender and just in general, the individual, it's very different. Sodium, it's one that, or salt in general, it's one that we talk also a lot about. This is one study, it's from 24, that also assessed the knowledge of sodium, salt intake, and also the strategies that athletes have in replacing or in managing sodium concentration in the body. And interestingly, there were a lot of athletes, 80%, that knew about it, that had thought about it, but only really 29 really they had a specific plan to replace it or to avoid really huge losses of sodium. So again, I think this is just another example that highlights that a lot of our athletes, they do have the knowledge, but a lot of athletes then lack the skills or don't really put the knowledge also into practice, or maybe they don't know how to put the knowledge into practice. And this is where also we as experts then need to support them. So they have their plan, and they also know then how to manage their hydration status or sodium concentration in the body. And then I added here another study, it's from 25, and this one showed that they assessed sodium concentration in soccer players in the sweat. And this was very interesting because they had some insignificant differences among those athletes, among those players. And the authors came to the conclusion that it's not necessary really to focus on sodium replacement here in soccer players. It's more about carbohydrates and fluids, but you don't really need to pay that much attention on sodium replacement during a soccer practice or during the soccer match here. So, like Ian said also in the introduction, there are some very interesting different opinions, some conflicting results as well. There's for sure also some literature that suggests to add sodium to the sports drink. Which beverage is then a good one also to have? What are some good choices? What are maybe some choices for short sessions and longer sessions? And this is a nice overview of different options that we have. And in a lot of cases, I see athletes that train with water. And I think when we talk about hydration in general, it's fine. When we talk about also adding some, ingesting some carbohydrates, it's maybe not the best fluid, the best beverage here to choose. For rehydration or to minimize dehydration first, it's okay to use water to replace what we've lost. But when it's really about electrolytes, when it's about carbohydrates, then water alone is not enough. Even though it's maybe a mineral water, the concentration is not high enough also to replace those losses, and we would have to add at least some extra sodium, a bit of salt to replace this one. Sports drinks, usually they do have at least some sodium and carbohydrates. The other electrolytes, not all of them are usually added, but magnesium, Calcium and potassium are usually also found in a lot of sports drinks. And they're okay, especially for rehydration, replacing also electrolytes. We need them in training. We don't need them outside of training unless it's really a hard training day. And I think also then fruit juices, they do have a little bit of electrolytes in them as well. Usually it's potassium that's higher there. They do not have a lot of sodium. So if your salt is better, you would need to add a little bit of sodium or salt there to replace the losses. So you have the carbs, but you probably lack the most important electrolyte then, which is the sodium. And soft drinks, they do not really correspond to the recommendations around electrolytes. Also, the carbohydrate concentration probably not the best with this one. And I have one slide later on osmolality as well. So for sure, something that there are better options than soft drinks to replace it. Which brings me to this slide here, talking about osmolality, the concentration of carbohydrates. Of course, and most importantly, in the different sports drink. And we do hear a lot of isotonic and hypertonic sports drinks. Isotonic sports drinks where we have the same concentration of the sports drinks compared to the plasma in the body. A lot of sports drinks are isotonic, same concentration, which is good for getting the fluids back into the body during exercise. Actually, a hypertonic sports drink is better if it's just about hydration or rehydration during exercise. The hypertonic, which is also the case for a lot of sodas, energy drinks, is not the best approach for fluid intake and for rehydration during exercise, because the concentration in those drinks is very high and is higher compared to the plasma in the body. So it's not the perfect option. And I have a few listed here as well to give you some examples. It's a German list, but the osmolality here, when we look at it, it's usually it should be around 300, 350. Then we talk about an isotonic sports drink, and we see that a lot of the brands out there, they do have an osmolality that is around this range here. And they're all okay. Usually a lot of those popular brands, Power Bar, Sponsor, Namet, 226s, what else is out there, SIS, they usually are in this range. So a lot of the common sports drinks, they correspond to this osmolality here. Homemade sports drinks is a little bit different, but the common ones are there. And this all depends then, of course, if it's a good sports drink or not. And the first step for the answer also, what should I drink and is this an appropriate drink, is really to look first also to look at the ingredients list, what's on there, carbohydrates, but also electrolytes. Are there electrolytes in them? How is also the ranking there? If I'm a salty sweater, is there sodium in it, or is there probably more magnesium in it? Just also to see what's in the sports drinks. This will also help us. And then the concentration of the carbohydrates to determine if this is a good one for us and that we can use. And maybe if we only do like 30-minute, 40-minute sessions, then and we don't need to replace electrolytes, then we don't even need to worry about the concentration in those. And just make sure that we have maybe carbohydrates that we need for an intense session, and make sure that there is the right amount of carbohydrates in the sports drink. So in the end, really for hydration, it's and the sports drink, there are a lot of different products out there, but I think we can also I want to encourage people also to keep it really simple and to think first about what's my goal? What goal do I have with this beverage? Is it just to cool the body? Is it to keep fatigue low? How long are my sessions? Do I need to replace carbohydrates? Do I really need to worry about magnesium? Or doesn't it really matter if there is no magnesium in it? So the simplest sport drinks that I usually put together is it's just water, it's a bit of lemon juice, you have the honey and salt. And salt only if it's really maybe a longer session or if it's multiple sessions a day. But that's all you need, and that's all that you need to cover your needs during exercise. And all the rest on the ingredients list, it's a lot of things that it's just about marketing from the industry. It's not really needed. There's not really a lot of evidence to add a lot of nutrients and components to a sports drink. The simpler it is, sometimes also the better it is, the outcome, less complications. So really keep this very simple. And I added also the hypotonic carbohydrate drink here in case during exercise when the goal is really mainly also the hydration and not the carbohydrate replacement here. When we're dehydrated, how can we approach it? What can we do? Rehydration. So there are a lot of ways that need to hydration back to it. There is not one ideal recovery or rehydration drink. There is not one ideal or the best rehydration food plus water option. And this is, I think that's an advantage because we can really choose what we prefer, what feels good for us. I added a few options here, and that's what I usually also use. That's what I usually also recommend to my athletes. So salty pretzels, crackers, fresh fruit. We have vegetable broth here. Cut fruits, salty bread with a little bit of salt sprinkled on it. The smoothie. There are a lot of different ways. Chocolate milk that help us also rehydrate. And this is very nice because a lot of these foods we find them usually also at home in the kitchen. It's something that we have access to even when we travel and when we forgot maybe our electrolyte drink at home. There's always a way to find some salty pretzels and add some fresh fruit or some water, and we can at least rehydrate and replace the sodium that we lost. So there are a lot of simple ways that we can use to rehydrate and then bring our fluid status back. But it's also not so easy to successfully rehydrate. And of course, I added this study here. It's from combat sport athletes, and it's an extreme, but it just should highlight also that rehydration needs time. And even though we might have a good protocol, maybe sessions they're just too close one to the other, and there's not enough time to rehydrate. So rehydration also takes time. Regular intake of fluids after the session until the evening, starting right after the session to make sure that we get as much as fluids back into the body, that it stays there as well. But of course, the more we dehydrate, and that's why we need to pay attention to hydration during exercise. The more dehydrated we are at the end of the exercise, the more time it takes to really fully recover from it, to be again hydrated. So the mistakes that I make today in the afternoon session, in the evening session, I will pay for these tomorrow in the morning in my morning session, which is should be a good motivation to to work on it and then to get this ready. What I do with my athletes, I have put some sheets together with some information, but also I give them a worksheet where they have to fill out the gaps, where they have to assess their sweat rate in different conditions, different training intensities during the year. So we really know the sweat response of the body, that we know, or I know how to plan and what to put into the plan for the individual athlete. And it's easy to do. For me, it's very important. Try to remember my athletes quite regularly also to rehydrate after exercise and to pay attention to it. Sometimes when I have the time, when I have the possibility, I also go out and assess it, whether it's with urine-specific gravity or some urine sticks. For sure, also I give them or I remind them to pay attention to urine color and just make sure that they are hydrated in the morning and check this. But we put the plan together and then really implement it and I try to reassess to really stay on top of it. And additionally to this, I try to expose my athletes to different options to have the fresh food available, sports drinks, electrolyte drinks. When they are also in the hotel, to set up tables, to give them the chance also to grab the food and rehydrate, and make sure that they bring those fluids that they lost during exercise back into the system, so they start the next session again well hydrated. It's easy to do as well. It's a nice reminder. You don't even need to talk to your athlete, but when the bottles are on the table, it's easy for them to grab them and to start rehydration. And like even on these pictures here, there are a lot of different ways to start rehydration and replacement of the electrolytes lost. And this brings me back then to sodium hyponatremia, hypernatremia, of course, very important topic. But also I think in not in all cases, but in some cases, there's just too much emphasis also on replacing and ingesting sodium and salt tablets. And I think there's a good reason to add those to competitions and to training, but when it's a very long session, when it's a very challenging situation, when it's an extreme environment. But I think some athletes that train for 90 minutes or 2 hours, and they don't really need to add the sodium or salt tablets to the session. There is a bit of sodium in the sports drink, and there is a lot of salt in the food that we eat. And like the examples before showed also, if we add really on purpose some salty crackers after the session to replace those the sodium in the body, there are a lot of good ways, natural ways, without the sodium or salt tablets, that we can work with, and then they're still effective, and it's just a natural way. So apart from using or excess use of salt tablets, what are some other common mistakes that I have seen and I have noticed? For sure, it's that a lot of athletes, they don't have any hydration strategy at all. And if you don't have a strategy, then you cannot really start your exercise and implement it. And what you usually do is you react to something, you react to a symptom, and whether it's just the thirst or just a decrease in performance, you study fluid intake when you feel it's getting really hot, and then when it's getting hard. But this is usually when it's too late, so we need to have the strategy ready. And even up to the top level, a lot of athletes, they do not have, never really have assessed their sweat rate, and they don't really know. They go by feeling, but they've never really assessed how much they need to drink. Some athletes, they wait until the point where they feel really thirsty, and then they drink a lot. They drink 45, 400, 500 milliliters, or even a liter after exercise, because they are overheated, because they're thirsty, because they're dehydrated. So really this regular fluid intake is something that is very important. And the other mistake, of course, is that a lot of athletes, they use those pre-hydration drinks during exercise, or they just use energy drinks. Sometimes they use coconut water, which has some electrolytes, but especially if you're a salty sweater, you will not be successful in replacing your sodium losses with coconut water, because the concentration is pretty low. So you also need to tweak things around here, and need to make sure you have the appropriate beverage to achieve the goals that you set. And the challenge is, of course, different training facilities. And we tend to think, at least it's my impression, always of a training facility where you have access to fluids, to the restroom, and where it's also easy then to hydrate and then rehydrate. But a lot of our athletes, they train on the water, they are on the mountain, whether it's runners, skiers, where they do not have access to water, where there's no possibility, if you're an alpine skier, to just go to the restroom. So there's a lot of reasons why some alpine skiers, they just don't drink as much as they should, because they want to avoid that they have to go to the restroom, and they just want to stay on the snow and get their session done and get as much runs as possible into the session. And of course, the duration. It's also how much fluids can I carry with me when I'm on the mountain. It's weight that I need to carry. And during the competition, you can only maybe ingest and carry with you a certain number of bottles. Especially runners sometimes have the issue even when they run at home and there is no access to fluids. So they come back and they are significantly dehydrated. So let me close last few slides just on the case studies. And I took three different case studies, and because there are a lot of different situations, and I want to start with one. It was really simple, and this is from the work with BMC. It's now, this actually is 10 years now that we did the hour record. We worked on it, and I thought about this because for me it was an ideal situation, considering all the aspects, all the impacts on hydration status, the preparation, the conditions, environments. It's a very cool, it's a very standardized setup there. Um, you can really plan for this 1 hour. So this one made it really simple. We were there a week ahead of the hour record day, and it was really good to assess everything and then put the plan together. And we'd done already a little bit of preparation beforehand, but then being on the track, assessing again hydration status, sweat rate. We had the pre-hydration or the pre-hydration drink. We had everything identified, everything set up. So this was really cool because it's almost like in the lab, and you can do your intervention as a sports dietitian. You can assess it and then you can plan it, and you just do a couple of test runs, and then you can make sure that your athletes finishes this 1 hour in the best shape possible, with the best hydration status possible. So this one was very simple, not in really a lot of complications, but it's an exception, and it's not the rule. You do not have a lot of days or possibilities to set it up like this. Usually we have different races, we have different environmental conditions. And with this triathlete, 25 years of age, male, and 70 kilos, he had some GI issues, and he approached me because he thought, okay, there's something wrong with my fluid, with my carbohydrates, with my timing, and so we analyzed his middle distance triathlon, and his finish time was a little bit less than 4 hours. And he started to have issues in the late bike parts, and we analyzed it. I asked him, and then he could recall most of the foods that he ingested, how he went into the race, and also his hydration strategy. And he didn't really have a strategy. He had his bottles on the bike, but he also said he finished on the bike and one bottle was still completely full, so he didn't really drink a lot. And we had hot conditions on this weekend also. So the analysis showed that he was just drinking about 500 milliliters per hour, and he was quite ingesting quite some carbs there. So in my work then with him, we started from zero. We started to assess his sweat rate, and sweat rate was pretty high with 2.5 liters per hour in these hot, humid conditions there, very similar to race day. And he was also a very salty sweater. So this showed already there were some issues with his hydration. And we started to work on it to make it a routine for him also to ingest fluids on the bike and also during running, which is of course even more complicated and sometimes really challenging. But it worked, and he got better in it. He did some more races afterwards, and we got better, and he got better in hydrating his body, and it's still an ongoing process, but it's getting better, and it's getting more a routine to ingest the fluids there. And the third case, biathlete, also here, it was the first time that we had sports nutrition work, never really had any input, really a good on national level already there. And the symptoms here were a headache, and in the mid-training also some really performance decrease and some cramping, especially when there were 2 sessions a day and when there was a long endurance session. And we assessed also here the sweat rate, and it was in the training session, it was like 4% dehydration after the training. But what was also very important for me, the session was already, the dehydration was already present before even the training there. So already, again, a case here where athletes started dehydrated into the session. So for this athletes was again starting here from zero, setting up hydration protocol, making sure the intake is enough, making it a routine, but also having a recovery protocol ready for sessions with 1 or 2 days with 1 or 2 sessions to make sure that the body is rehydrated, especially also in the next morning. And the final slide for me, of course, I really talk a lot about the tools that we have available, also to assess maybe sodium concentration or to identify the perfect sports drink. And there are some great tools out there. Sweat patches are one of them. There has been a quite improvement also in the quality of those patches. But I just mentioned here a paper that's been recently been published, and they looked at all the tools that are available there, and the authors here highlight that for a lot of athletes, it's not really necessary to assess sodium concentration, electrolyte concentration, to then adjust the sports drink, the electrolyte concentration of the personal sports drink. But I think especially for athletes that have long races, it's very good also. It's a good feedback to see your sodium concentration is, and maybe that you just need to pay more attention to get enough sodium back into the system, whether it's during exercise or after exercise. But I think there will be more on the market in the future. We're still at the beginning. That's my opinion. And I think there will be some great tools available to better manage hydration status. So to summarize, I think it's very important to maybe move up the hydration chapter a little bit in the book chapters, also to draw attention really more to hydration and fluids, and to encourage our athletes to pay more attention to it, but also to assess their individual sweat rate. In the end, it's a lot about individualization in training, and we should do it also in nutrition with hydration, sports drink, hydration protocols. And yeah, for electrolytes, my approach also is to put the food first. There are some exceptions, but for most athletes, food first is still a good way to go. And of course, if we start dehydrated or when we get dehydrated during exercise, then we'll stay dehydrated and it's only limiting the damage. So having a protocol in mind, but also putting it into practice and really also implementing it is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. That was great. And talking about books and chapters, Judith was also co-author in the hydration chapter in our new textbook. So we've got a new textbook that was just published. I don't know if you can see it, the Integrative Sport and Exercise Nutrition textbook. I've got this background that's maybe Ian can show it without because my background is not letting me show it. But we just published it about a month ago, and it's a book that really highlights the integrative approach. So thinking about the health of an athlete and looking at the different body systems. So Judith is co-author in the hydration chapter. If you want to read about it, it's really interesting. So yeah, Ian
I
is
can show up without the background on.
Yeah,
So
and there's some really nice. Sorry, go ahead.
There is, I think it's 25% off until the end of November. So you can find it on our website.
Yeah, and there's some really nice recipes in there as well, including sports drinks. So just before we go, Judith, if you don't mind, we'll have a couple of questions. So from Scott, asking about younger athletes, so like your youth athletes, does the 2% guideline still apply? Or given that their thermoregulation maturity, would it be less than the 2% guideline?
Well, the short answer is we don't know because we have no studies in young athletes. So we're usually just using what we know from the adult athletes. But I think in general, then I would try to minimize dehydration. It's not that they need to really keep their weight stable, but thermoregulation is not as good in young athletes compared to adults, and I think also in general it's just a lot of stress. So keeping them also in this range, maximum 2%, is a good approach.
Cool, thank you. And then one from Togo about sweat rates indoors versus outdoors. Yeah, obviously there's going to be many factors there. You highlighted that with the case study being indoors.
Yes, there are some differences, and even when you just think about being on the bike, you have the wind. It's just different being there on the rollers, on the trainer, indoors, and even if you have maybe a fan next to you or you have the window open, body core temperature indoors is usually is higher. Sweat rate is also higher, and when I just think back to the pandemic, we had a lot of even elite athletes that really struggled to replace fluid losses, but also electrolyte losses because they were just huge and they were spending hours on the bike. And I even remember one article that mentioned an elite athlete who was transported to the hospital because he couldn't manage his rehydration. And after a few days, really long, hard training on the trainer, he got so dehydrated that it was really critical for him. So yes, there are some differences, and if you train indoors, I'm not aware of any recommendations really for electrolyte replacement, but for sure, yes, if you're training now in the winter, we train more indoors, paying more attention, maybe adding one or the other electrolyte tablet to your sports drink during the day is probably a good idea.
And then last one, because I feel like you've answered the other questions. So from Catherine, could you potentially talk about strategically training in a dehydrated state and any possible adaptations that may occur? Would you ever recommend it or suggest it? And do you have any insight on the role of genetics that in terms of hydration strategies? So, for example, sodium transporters, vasopressin regulation, and so on.
For the last question, I do not really have, and I'm not aware of, never really read about this and go more into detail about this, so I cannot answer this question. The other one was, the first one was about
Strategically training in a dehydrated
yeah.
state.
Yeah, this is something that I also do on the elite level with a few athletes, and of course, again, it's also training the body to perform in a suboptimal state, and especially if we have endurance athletes that will at some point also get into this dehydrated situation, because if you're a triathlete and it's really hot, it's humid, if you're a cyclist or a runner, and you're exposed to this, then it's also good to be trained in competing in this situation there and performing in this dehydrated state. So yes, I do sometimes also add this to the training. And not too often, because in the end you also need to keep in mind it's more stress for the immune system, it's more stress for the body in general. So if there is a intense training block already, I try to set it up the best way possible so that the only stress is really it's just about training and not dehydration on top of this, or extra dehydration, is more severe dehydration. But yes, adding it for sure it will also help the athlete getting better in this situation.
Cool. Thank you, Judith. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'll send out a recording and the slides hopefully tomorrow or by the end of the week. And I'll also include the link to the textbook with the discount code if you're interested. There's a whole on our website, we've got a detailed description of all the chapters so you can have a look. Yeah, thank you everyone. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening. Thank you, Judith.
Bye.
Bye.